Imagine walking into a doctor's office in 1890. The man across from you might have spent 2 years, sometimes just one, at a school with no labs, no cadavers, no clinical training, and no entrance requirements beyond the ability to pay tuition. He might never have seen a patient before he saw you. He might have bought his diploma outright from a degree mill in Chicago or Cincinnati. And yet, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of your community, he was a physician. This was medicine in America before the Flexner Report, a landscape so chaotic, so unregulated, and so saturated with quackery that it bordered on a public health crisis. And it took one extraordinary family and a single devastating document to change all of it forever. To understand the Flexner story, you first have to understand the world that made it necessary. In the decades following the American Civil War, the United States was experiencing a medical school boom. And not the good kind. Between 1810 and 1910, more than 400 medical schools were founded across the country. Many of them were purely commercial operations, proprietary schools run by small groups of doctors who charged tuition, pocketed the profits, and had every financial incentive to keep students enrolled and graduating, regardless of their actual competence. There was no national licensing standard. There was no agreement on what a medical curriculum should look like. Admission requirements were almost non-existent. In many schools, you didn't even need a high school diploma to begin studying medicine. The profession itself was deeply fractured. There were regular physicians, those trained in what we might recognize as conventional medicine, but alongside them existed a sprawling ecosystem of alternative practitioners, homeopaths, eclectics, osteopaths, hydrotherapists, and a dozen other sects, each with their own schools, their own journals, and their own theories about what caused disease and how to treat it. Patients navigated this chaos largely alone, with no way to distinguish a competent physician from an outright fraud. And the frauds were everywhere. Patent medicines laced with alcohol, morphine, or cocaine were sold freely. Treatments ranged from the merely ineffective to the genuinely dangerous. The American Medical Association had existed since 1847, but for most of the 19th century it was a relatively weak body, unable to enforce standards even if it had wanted to. By the early 1900s, however, a reform movement was gathering momentum inside the profession. A new generation of physicians, many of them trained in Germany, where medicine had become a rigorous scientific discipline rooted in laboratory research, were returning to the United States with a very different vision of what a doctor should be. They wanted medicine to be a science. They wanted medical education to be demanding, systematic, and grounded in biology, chemistry, and pathology. And they were increasingly horrified by the state of the schools that were churning out practitioners by the thousands. It was in this climate that the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching decided to commission a comprehensive survey of medical education in America and Canada. The year was 1908. The man they chose to conduct the survey was not a physician. He was not a scientist. He was an educator, a man who had spent his career thinking about schools and standards and the nature of genuine learning. His name was Abraham Flexner, and the report he would produce would become one of the most consequential documents in the history of American medicine. Abraham Flexner was born in 1866 in Louisville, Kentucky, the sixth of 9 children born to Moritz and Esther Flexner, Jewish immigrants from Bohemia who had settled in the American Midwest. The Flexner household was not wealthy, but it was intellectually alive. Moritz Flexner worked as a hat merchant and struggled financially for much of his life, but he and Esther placed enormous value on education. All 9 of their children would grow up to achieve remarkable things, a fact that makes the Flexner family one of the most extraordinary sibling groups in American intellectual history. But we'll come back to the siblings, because the dynasty is bigger than Abraham alone. Abraham excelled early. He entered Johns Hopkins University at 15 and graduated in just 2 years, in 1886. He returned to Louisville and founded his own preparatory school, which he ran for nearly 2 decades. It was a progressive institution, small classes, rigorous standards, no grades, a focus on genuine understanding over rote memorization. The school became something of a local legend, and it gave Abraham a deep, hands-on understanding of how institutions of learning actually function and how they fail. When he eventually closed the school and went back to study, first at Harvard, then in Germany, he carried with him a framework for thinking about education that was analytical, unsparing, and intensely practical. By the time Henry Pritchett, the president of the Carnegie Foundation, approached him about surveying American medical schools, Flexner was an unknown outside educational circles. He had no medical training. He had no connections to the medical establishment. Pritchett believed that was precisely the point. He wanted fresh eyes. He wanted someone who would look at these institutions not as an insider protecting professional turf, but as an analyst asking a blunt, simple question. Are these schools actually doing what they claim to do? The answer, Flexner would discover, was largely no. He spent the better part of 2 years visiting medical schools across the United States and Canada. He visited all 155 of them. He showed up unannounced. He walked through the buildings, examined the laboratories, or the absence of laboratories, inspected the hospital affiliations, interviewed faculty, and looked at admission records. What he found was damning. Many schools operated out of a single building with no lab equipment. Some had no library. Some had no hospital affiliation at all, meaning students graduated without ever having treated a real patient under supervision. Admission standards were a fiction. Faculty were often poorly trained practitioners moonlighting as teachers for the extra income. He documented all of it. Carefully. Systematically. Without sentiment. And in 1910, the Carnegie Foundation published his findings under the title Medical Education in the United States and Canada. It would come to be known simply as the Flexner Report. And it would detonate like a bomb at the center of American medical education. The Flexner Report was not a polite document. Abraham Flexner was not interested in being polite. He was interested in being accurate, and accuracy, in this case, required language that was direct to the point of brutality. School after school was described in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. Facilities were called wretched. Faculties were described as incompetent. Admission processes were exposed as non-existent. Some schools received descriptions so scathing that their boards of trustees read the published report and voted to close rather than face the public humiliation of operating under that characterization. The report had a specific vision of what medical education should look like, and that vision was modeled almost entirely on Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, which had opened in 1893 and was, by 1910, widely regarded as the finest medical institution in the country. Johns Hopkins required a college degree for admission. It had full-time faculty who were research scientists as well as clinicians. It had a teaching hospital directly integrated into the curriculum, so students moved from the laboratory to the bedside as a matter of course. It demanded 4 years of rigorous study. Flexner held Johns Hopkins up as the standard against which every other school was measured, and against that standard, almost everything else fell short. The report named names. It named cities. It published assessments of specific institutions that were factual, damning, and impossible to ignore. The press picked it up immediately. Newspapers across the country ran stories summarizing Flexner's findings. The public, it turned out, was deeply interested in learning which medical schools were diploma mills and which were legitimate. State legislatures, which controlled medical licensing, began paying attention. The Amherst Council on Medical Education, which had already been working quietly on reform, now had a public mandate and a detailed roadmap. The institutional collapse that followed was swift and startling. In 1906, there were 162 medical schools in the United States. By 1920, that number had fallen to 85. By 1935, it was 6 to 6. Roughly half of all medical schools in the country closed in the 2 decades following the publication of the Flexner Report. The weaker schools, underfunded, understaffed, operating without labs or hospital affiliations, simply couldn't survive the new scrutiny. Accreditation bodies grew teeth. State licensing boards began requiring graduation from an approved school. The bar was raised, and raised dramatically, in a very short period of time. The effects on the profession were profound. Medicine became genuinely more scientific. The laboratory became central to medical training. Bacteriology, physiology, biochemistry. These were no longer optional additions to a curriculum but foundational requirements. The physician who emerged from training after 1920 was a categorically different kind of practitioner than the one who had emerged in 1890. They had spent time in labs. They understood the germ theory of disease. They had seen patients in supervised clinical settings before going out into practice on their own. The gap between what medicine could actually do and what it claimed to do began, slowly, to close. But the Flexner Report also had consequences that were darker and more complicated. Consequences that historians have spent decades grappling with. Because the consolidation of medical education was not a neutral process. It had winners and losers, and the losers were not randomly distributed. Before the report, There were 7 medical schools in the United States that were specifically dedicated to training black physicians. These schools existed because mainstream medical institutions, with very few exceptions, refused to admit black students. Howard University College of Medicine and Meharry Medical College were the largest and most established of them. Flexner visited these schools too, and his assessments of them were mixed. Howard and Meharry he praised as worth saving, as institutions that served a genuine social need. But 5 of the other black medical schools he rated poorly, and in the wave of consolidation that followed, all 5 closed. The number of black physicians in America dropped sharply. Access to medical care in black communities, already limited, deteriorated further. For decades, Howard and Meharry trained the vast majority of black doctors in America, operating under enormous resource constraints because they were systematically excluded from the philanthropic funding that flowed to mainstream institutions. A similar dynamic played out for women. Before the Flexner Report, a small number of women's medical colleges existed and were training female physicians in meaningful numbers. After the consolidation, most of those schools closed, and the institutions that absorbed their functions were largely unwilling to admit women in significant numbers. The percentage of women in American medicine actually declined in the decades following the report and did not begin recovering until well into the second half of the 20th century. These outcomes are not incidental. They are part of the story. The Flexner Report reformed American medicine in ways that were genuinely beneficial. It raised standards, it grounded the profession in science, it protected patients from the worst of the quackery that had flourished in the unregulated system. But it also consolidated power in institutions that were white, male, and upper class, and it did so at the direct expense of communities that had been building their own pathways into the profession against significant odds. Abraham Flexner spent the rest of his long life. He lived until 1959, dying at the age of 92, working in education and philanthropy. He helped shape the General Education Board, the Rockefeller-funded body that distributed enormous sums to universities and medical schools in the years after the report. He later founded the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where Albert Einstein would spend the last decades of his life. Flexner was, by any measure, one of the most influential figures in 20th century American intellectual life. But he remained, in his own self-understanding, primarily an educator, someone who cared about standards, rigor, and the integrity of institutions. What he perhaps did not fully reckon with, and what we must, is that institutions have politics, and standards can be wielded as instruments of exclusion as readily as instruments of excellence. Both things are true simultaneously about the Flexner Report. It was a masterwork of investigative analysis, and it helped cement a structure of medical education that disadvantaged women and minorities for generations. Understanding the report means holding both of those truths at once. Abraham Flexner is the name history remembers most readily. The report bears his name. The plaudits and the critiques circle back to him. But to speak of a Flexner dynasty is to speak of something larger than one man and one document. The family Abraham came from, those 9 children of Moritz and Esther Flexner, raised in a Louisville household of modest means and modest ambitions, produced a remarkable constellation of achievers across medicine, law, diplomacy, and the arts. To understand the full scope of the Flexner legacy is to see that Abraham's impact, extraordinary as it was one thread in a much richer tapestry. The sibling who stands most directly beside Abraham in terms of historical significance is Simon Flexner. Born in 1863, 3 years before Abraham, Simon was the one who actually went into medicine, and he went into it at the highest possible level. Where Abraham reformed medical education from the outside, Simon transformed biomedical research from within. His career is one of the great scientific lives of the early 20th century, and it deserves to be understood in its own right. Simon's path into medicine was not straightforward. As a young man, he worked in his father's hat business and later in a pharmacy, and it was there that his fascination with the natural world, with specimens, with chemical processes, with the mechanics of the biological, began to take shape. He eventually enrolled at the Louisville College of Medicine and graduated in 1889. He was a capable student, but what set him apart from the beginning was his almost obsessive interest in pathology, in understanding disease at the level of tissue and cell rather than at the level of symptom and treatment. He went to Johns Hopkins, the same institution that would later serve as Abraham's template for the ideal medical school, where he worked under William Henry Welsh, who was perhaps the most important figure in establishing American pathology as a serious scientific discipline. Welsh recognized in Simon Flexner something exceptional, a mind that combined meticulous observational skill with a genuine instinct for the significant question. Under Welsh's mentorship, Simon's career accelerated rapidly. He conducted important early research on dysentery, on meningitis, on the pathology of infectious disease more broadly. He traveled to the Philippines to study the cholera outbreak there. He worked in Japan. His reputation as a scientist of the first rank was established before he was 40. In 1901, Simon Flexner was appointed the first director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City, what would eventually become Rockefeller University. This appointment was transformative, both for Simon personally and for American science institutionally. The Rockefeller Institute was the first institution in the United States dedicated purely to biomedical research, not teaching, not patient care, but research. The idea that a great research institution could exist for its own sake, pursuing knowledge without the immediate pressure to train students or treat patients, was still a novel one in America, though it had deep roots in Germany. Under Simon Flexner's direction, which lasted until 1935, the Rockefeller Institute became one of the premier biomedical research centers in the world. The work done there during his tenure touched on some of the most urgent medical problems of the era. Most dramatically, Simon himself played a central role in the fight against epidemic cerebrospinal meningitis, bacterial meningitis, which at the time killed a large majority of those it infected. Working with colleagues, he developed an antiserum therapy that dramatically reduced the mortality rate from the disease. It was one of the most significant therapeutic advances of the early 20th century, achieved before the age of antibiotics, and it saved an enormous number of lives. He was also deeply involved in the scientific response to the 1916 polio epidemic in New York, one of the worst outbreaks of infantile paralysis the country had ever seen. Simon's research on polio, his identification of the polio virus, his work on how the virus traveled through the body, laid important groundwork for the eventual development of the polio vaccine decades later, though the path from his foundational work to Jonas Salk's vaccine was long and involved many other scientists. He was also an early and important voice in the movement to establish that viruses were a distinct category of pathogen, smaller than bacteria, different in their biology, requiring different approaches to study and control. Beyond his own bench science, Simon Flexner's most lasting contribution may have been his role as an institution builder and talent spotter. The scientists he recruited to the Rockefeller Institute during his tenure included some of the most important figures in early 20th century biomedicine. He created an environment where first-rate scientists had the freedom and the resources to pursue long-range research programs without the constant pressure to produce immediately applicable results. This model, the Research Institute as a protected space for fundamental inquiry, shaped American biomedical science profoundly, and its influence is still visible in the structure of research universities and institutes today. Simon Flexner was also deeply connected to the broader intellectual world of his time. He was a close friend and confidant of H.G. Wells, with whom he maintained a long correspondence. He was a significant figure in the transatlantic exchange of scientific ideas between America and Europe. And he was, by many accounts, a man of genuine warmth and personal generosity, someone who took the mentorship of younger scientists seriously as a moral obligation and not merely a professional duty. The other Flexner siblings extended the family's reach into still other domains. Bernard Flexner, the youngest brother, became a distinguished lawyer and a prominent figure in early Zionist organization in America, working closely with Louis Brandeis on the legal and political frameworks for Jewish institutional life. He was involved in relief work during the First World War and was a sophisticated operator in the world of international law and diplomacy. Jacob Flexner had a career in business and civic life. Washington Flexner and Isidore Flexner contributed in their own ways to the family's communal and professional presence. The sisters, Mary, Gertrude, and Jenny, lived in an era when professional options for women were sharply constrained, but they were by all accounts educated, engaged, and central to the family's intellectual life. What do we make of all of this, when we pull back and look at the whole picture? The Flexner dynasty is, in one sense, a story about a remarkable immigrant family and the extraordinary degree to which the children of Moritz and Esther Flexner channeled the ambitions and anxieties of the American immigrant experience into achievement. It is a story about what becomes possible when intellectual drive meets opportunity, and about how those opportunities were shaped by the specific cultural and historical moment in which the Flexners came of age. But the dynasty is also something more than a family story. Through Abraham and Simon in particular, the Flexners helped determine what American medicine would become in the 20th century, what kinds of knowledge it would value, What kinds of institutions would house it, who would be trained to practice it, and what standards would govern its practice? That is an enormous inheritance to leave behind. And like most large inheritances, it is mixed. The scientific medicine that Abraham's report helped establish genuinely worked better, healed more people, and reduced suffering in ways that the chaotic pre-Flexner system never could. The research culture that Simon built at the Rockefeller Institute produced knowledge that saved millions of lives. These are not small things. At the same time, the consolidation they helped bring about created a medical profession that was more exclusive, more expensive, and more difficult to enter for those who existed outside the dominant social structures of early 20th century America. The physician became a prestigious, well-compensated professional, but also an increasingly inaccessible one, in terms of both cost to patients and barriers to entry for aspiring doctors from marginalized communities. Those tensions, between excellence and access, between standards and equity, are still with us. They animate current debates about medical school admissions, about the cost of healthcare, about the racial and gender composition of the physician workforce. The Flexner dynasty didn't create those tensions, but it shaped the specific form they take in American life. The most honest accounting of the Flexner legacy is probably this: two brothers, shaped by a remarkable family and a turbulent historical moment, looked at institutions that were failing the people they were supposed to serve, and they pushed, hard and effectively, towards something better. They got a great deal right. They got some things badly wrong, or at least failed to reckon fully with the human costs of the changes they were helping to engineer. And the world they helped make is the world we still, in many ways, inhabit. That, ultimately, is what makes them worth knowing. Not because they were heroes or villains, but because they were consequential, and because consequence, in history, is almost always more complicated than it first appears.